Imagine a giant rising from the sea, 300 feet of oxidized copper, a crown of 7 spikes piercing the New York skyline, and a torch held high, a beacon for the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. For over a century, this image has been the global screensaver for democracy. It is the first thing millions of immigrants saw as they steamed into the harbor, a promise of a fresh start. We are taught that she was a gift of friendship from France, a symbol of enlightenment, and a welcoming mother to the world's outcasts. But what if the statue we see today is wearing a mask? What if the mother of exiles wasn't originally intended for the tired and the poor at all? If you take a boat to Liberty Island today and stand at the very base of the pedestal, you will see the famous tablet in her left arm, inscribed with the date of American independence. But if you were to fly a drone directly above her feet, hidden by the folds of her heavy robes, you would see something the postcards never show you. You would see broken shackles and chains. Most people assume these chains represent America's break from British tyranny in 1776. That is the safe version of the story. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. The Statue of Liberty was not born out of a celebration of American victory. She was born out of a funeral for a dream that was dying. She was not a gift for what America was, but a desperate plea for what a small group of Frenchmen hoped America could be. The year is 1865. The American Civil War has just ended. The soil of Virginia and Georgia is still soaked with the blood of brothers. In a small village near Versailles, France, a group of elite intellectuals gathers for a dinner party. The host is Edouard de Laboulaye, the most prominent abolitionist of his time. To Laboulaye, the Union's victory wasn't just a military win. It was the ultimate proof that democracy could survive the abolition of slavery. He looked at the United States and saw a flickering candle in a world dominated by kings and emperors. But Laboulaye knew something the history books often gloss over. The end of the war didn't mean the end of the struggle. He saw the black codes rising in the South. He saw the transition from literal chains to systemic ones. He turned to a young, ambitious sculptor named Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi and proposed a monument, not a monument to immigration. That word wasn't even in the original pitch, but a monument to Libertas, the Roman goddess of freedom, specifically a monument to the abolition of slavery. Here is the first dark truth that America rarely discusses. The Statue of Liberty wasn't even meant for America. Before Bartholdi ever looked toward Manhattan, he was obsessed with the East. He had spent years sketching a massive project for the Suez Canal in Egypt. It was to be a colossal lighthouse in the shape of an Egyptian peasant woman holding a torch. Titled Egypt Carrying the Light to Asia, Bartholdi poured his soul into the Egyptian design, but the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, went bankrupt and rejected the project. Left with vision but no venue, Bartholdi didn't scrap the idea. He recycled it. He took the sketches of the Egyptian peasant, swapped the robes for a Roman stola, changed the face, some say to look like a stern mother, and suddenly the Egyptian light was rebranded as American Liberty. This wasn't a gift from the people of France in the way we imagine it, a national collection. It was a private marketing campaign by two men who needed a home for a rejected statue and a political message that was rapidly losing favor in their own country. As we stand in the harbor in 1886, the day of the dedication, the atmosphere is electric but hypocritical. The dark truth starts to manifest in the very crowd attending the ceremony. While the speakers on the podium talked about liberty enlightening the world, the city of New York was a tinderbox of inequality. Only 2 women were allowed on the pedestal for the ceremony, Bartholdi's wife and the daughter of the French engineer. Real American women, who still didn't have the right to vote, protested in boats nearby, pointing out the irony of a giant female statue representing liberty in a land where women were legally second-class citizens. African-American newspapers of the time, like the Cleveland Gazette, were even more scathing. They pointed out that the shackles at the statue's feet were a mockery. How could liberty hold a torch for the world when a man who had been freed 20 years prior was being lynched in the streets of the South? The Statue of Liberty is a masterpiece of engineering, but is also a masterpiece of distraction. We see the torch, but we ignore the broken chains. We see the poem by Emma Lazarus, but we forget that her words weren't added until 17 years after the statue was built, as a desperate attempt to give the monument a purpose people actually cared about. In June 1885, The French frigate Isère steamed into New York Harbor, carrying 214 massive wooden crates. Inside were the hammered copper sheets of the statue, disassembled like a giant metallic jigsaw puzzle. The city cheered. The Navy fired cannons. But as the crates were stacked on Bedloe's Island, a dark realization set in. There was nowhere to put her. The American Committee for the Statue of Liberty was broke. They had spent what little they had on a foundation, and now, with the gift sitting on their doorstep, they were short by over $100,000, a massive sum in the late 19th century. The dark truth of this era is that the American elite, the Vanderbilts and the Astors, didn't want the statue. To them, she was a French white elephant, a useless, expensive monument to radical ideas of liberty they found threatening to their industrial monopolies. Congress refused to provide a single cent. The New York State Assembly followed suit. For months, the crate sat in the salt air, beginning to corrode. There was a very real possibility that the greatest monument in the Western world would be sold for scrap metal. This is where the narrative takes a cynical turn. The wealthy founding fathers of New York's Gilded Age turned their backs on the project because it didn't serve their bottom line. The statue wasn't American enough for the nationalists, and it was too revolutionary for conservatives. The irony is suffocating. A nation that claimed to be the wealthiest on earth couldn't afford a home for the very symbol of its existence. Enter Joseph Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant who had climbed his way up to own the New York World newspaper. Pulitzer saw an opportunity, but it wasn't purely out of the goodness of his heart. He saw a way to sell papers and humiliate the rich. Pulitzer launched a crowdfunding campaign that would make modern internet creators blush. He published scathing editorials attacking the millionaires for their stinginess. But his true genius, or his true exploitation, depending on how you view it, was targeting the poor. He promised to print the name of every single person who donated, even if it was just a penny. What followed was one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful and tragic moments in American history. Thousands of children, street sweepers, and washerwomen sent in their life savings, single cents and nickels, to build a pedestal for a statue they would likely never be allowed to stand on. One letter sent to Pulitzer read, "I am a young girl alone in the world. I send 60 cents, the results of my self-denial." Another came from a group of orphans who gave up their dinner to donate $1. These were the people who built the Statue of Liberty's foundation. Not the government, not the titans of industry, but the huddled masses who were literally starving. The dark truth. Here's a bitter pill. The pedestal is a monument to the failure of the American government and the exploitation of the immigrant working class's hope. While the money trickled in, the technical challenge was mounting. How do you make a 151-foot copper woman survive the hurricane-force winds of New York Harbor? Bartholdi knew his copper skin was too thin to stand on its own. It was only about the thickness of 2 pennies. He needed a skeleton. He turned to a man whose name would later become synonymous with another giant iron structure, Gustave Eiffel. Eiffel designed a revolutionary internal pylon, a massive iron tower that would act as a spine. But even this engineering marvel had a dark side. The iron and copper were doomed to react. Through a process called galvanic corrosion, the two metals would essentially try to eat each other over the next century. From the moment she was built, Lady Liberty was chemically committed to her own destruction. As the pedestal finally rose, a massive gray, concrete and granite fortress, the original meaning of the statue began to shift. The broken chains at her feet, the ones meant to celebrate the end of slavery, were being physically obscured by the high walls of the pedestal. If you stand on the ground, you can't see the chains. You have to be looking down from above. This was the first literal cover-up. By placing her so high, the designers ensured that the average person would only see the torch and the tablet, the safe symbols of law and light, while the dangerous symbol of revolution and the end of human bondage was hidden from the common gaze. By 1886, the pedestal was finished, and the puzzle was ready to be assembled. But as the copper sheets were riveted into place, a new shadow fell over the harbor. The day of the dedication was miserable. A thick, gray mist hung over New York Harbor, and a cold drizzle soaked the 1 million people who lined the streets of Manhattan. It was the largest public gathering in the city's history. President Grover Cleveland sat on a grandstand, surrounded by French dignitaries and the elite of Wall Street. A massive parade snaked through the city, a sea of top hats and brass bands. But if you looked closely at the crowds, the dark truth was written on the faces of those who weren't invited to the party. The Statue of Liberty was being unveiled as a symbol of universal liberty. Yet, on that very podium, there wasn't a single African-American leader. There wasn't a single representative of the millions of Native Americans whose lands had been systematically stripped away as the statue rose. And, most glaringly, there were almost no women. As the official ceremony began on Bedloe's Island, a small cattle boat steamed into the harbor, cutting through the mist. It was filled with members of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. They hadn't been invited to the island. Ironic, considering the statue was a 151-foot woman from the deck of their boat. They began to shout through megaphones, their voices drifting over the water to the ears of the president. They pointed out the gigantic absurdity of the moment. They asked how a nation could spend millions on a copper goddess representing liberty, while the flesh and blood women of that same nation were denied the right to vote, were legally owned by their husbands in many states, and had no voice in the laws that govern them. To the suffragettes, the statue was a beacon. It was a taunt. It was a hollow shell. As the veil was pulled off Lady Liberty's face, the women on the boat cried out that the torch was darkness to them. But if the suffragettes were angry, the African-American community was devastated. Remember, this statue was originally conceived by Edouard de Laboulaye to celebrate the end of slavery. He wanted those broken chains at her feet to be the focal point. By 1886, however, the narrative had already been sanitized. The Reconstruction era had failed. Jim Crow laws were being etched into the legal fabric of the South. Lynching was becoming a domestic terror tactic. The Cleveland Gazette, a prominent black newspaper, published an editorial that still stings today. They wrote, "Push the statue, torch and all, into the ocean until the liberty of this country is such as to make it possible for an inoffensive and industrious colored man to earn a respectable living for himself and family. The idea of the liberty of this country enlightening the world, or even Patagonia, is ridiculous in the extreme. The dark truth that America never talks about is that for the black population in 1886, the Statue of Liberty was a monument to a lie. The chains were broken on the statue's feet, but they were being reforged in the courtrooms and the prison farms of the American South. The statue was a look-over-here distraction while the promise of 1865 was being strangled in the dark. Even the diplomacy of the day was a facade. We are told the statue was a gift from the people of France. But in reality, the French government didn't send it. It was a private venture. And when it arrived, the U.S. government was so indifferent to this gift that they didn't even provide a budget for its maintenance. For the first few years of her life, Lady Liberty was a lighthouse, but she was a terrible one. The Lighthouse Board, under the Department of the Treasury, was put in charge of her. They complained bitterly about the cost of the oil and the electricity. The light was so dim it could barely be seen from a few miles away. Sailors complained it was more of a hazard than a help. The Mother of Exiles was essentially a homeless ward of the state, shuffled from one government department to another because no one wanted to pay the light bill for liberty. As the ceremony concluded and the fireworks struggled to ignite in the damp air, people began to wonder about the face of the statue itself. Bartholdi never officially confirmed who the model was. Legend says it was his mother, Charlotte, a stern, controlling woman. Others suggest it was a composite of many faces. But there's a darker theory that has persisted in the shadows of art history. Some researchers point back to Bartholdi's rejected Egyptian project. They suggest that the universal face of liberty is actually a repurposed face of an Egyptian fella peasant, stripped of her ethnic identity to make her palatable for a Western white audience. If true, it means the very face of America's greatest symbol is an act of cultural erasure, a woman whose identity was scrubbed, so she could represent an ideal that her own people were never allowed to reach. The party ended. The crowds went home, and the Statue of Liberty stood alone in the dark, rainy harbor. She was a monument without a clear mission. She wasn't an immigrant symbol yet. That would take another decade and a dying poet to achieve. For the millions of immigrants crossing the Atlantic in the late 19th century, the first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty wasn't a moment of cinematic joy. It was a moment of profound, bone-chilling terror. As their steamship slowed and the salt spray settled, the copper giant loomed out of the mist, not as a mother, but as a sentinel. The dark truth that history books sanitize is that Lady Liberty was the face of a massive, bureaucratic sorting machine. She stood exactly where the pure were separated from the tainted. To her left was the promise of New York. To her right was the grim reality of Ellis Island. We are told the statue welcomed the huddled masses, but the American government in the 1890s was obsessed with a new, pseudoscience-driven fear, biological contamination. As the mother of exiles held her torch, doctors in white coats stood in her shadow, armed with buttonhooks and chalk. They were looking for the unfit. If you had a limp, you were marked with an L. If you had a cough, a C. If you looked feeble-minded, a catch-all term for anyone who didn't speak English or seemed overwhelmed, you were marked with an X. The statue was a silent witness to the 6-second medical. This was a brutal, rapid-fire inspection where families were torn apart within sight of the torch. For every 100 who passed under her gaze, there were those who were deemed LPC, likely to become a public charge. These were the unwanted. The dark truth is that the statue's golden door was a one-way mirror. While she looked out toward Europe with a stony, welcoming gaze, her back was turned to the thousands of immigrants detained on Ellis Island. Some for days, some for months, in conditions that were often little better than the steerage holds they had just escaped. The harbor was a site of immense psychological trauma. Imagine being an immigrant who had sold everything to reach liberty, only to be held in a barred room, staring at the back of her head, waiting for a legal hearing that would likely deport you. To those trapped in the infirmaries of Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty wasn't a symbol of freedom. She was a symbol of exclusion. She was the gatekeeper of a club they weren't allowed to join. During this era, a dark movement was taking root in the American intellectual elite, eugenics. Many of the men who managed the harbor and the immigration process believed that liberty was a biological trait, one that belonged only to Nordic or Anglo-Saxon races. They looked at the Italians, the Jews, and the Slavs passing under the statue and saw inferior stock that would pollute the American bloodline. There are archival records of congressmen arguing that the Statue of Liberty was being insulted by the presence of these lower types. They wanted to use the statue as a literal border post to keep the wrong kind of people out. The dark truth is that the very symbol of universal freedom was being used as a justification for racial profiling and forced sterilizations. There is an even grimmer physical reality to the harbor. Bedloe's Island, now Liberty Island, and the neighboring Ellis Island were not the pristine parks we see today. They were surrounded by the filth of a burgeoning industrial city. The water around the statue's feet was often thick with raw sewage and the carcasses of animals. The mother of exiles stood in a graveyard of industrial waste. For the immigrants being processed, the smell of liberty wasn't the fresh air of the New World. It was the stench of decay. Furthermore, the island itself had a dark history long before the statue arrived. It had been a site for public executions and a quarantine station for smallpox and yellow fever. The ground upon which the pedestal sits is quite literally a site of death and disease. The copper goddess was built on top of a history of suffering that was paved over with granite and concrete. We cannot talk about the mother of exiles without talking about the poem, "Give me your tired, your poor." Most Americans believe these words were etched onto the statue from day one. They weren't. The poem by Emma Lazarus was written in 1883 to help raise money for the pedestal, but it was largely ignored. It wasn't until 1903, 17 years after dedication, that a friend of Lazarus finally got a plaque placed inside the pedestal. Why is this a dark truth? Because it proves that the welcoming identity of the statue was an afterthought. It was a PR campaign added decades later to soften the image of a monument that many people found cold, frightening, and elitist. The statue didn't start as a welcome mat. It started as a lighthouse for a country that was increasingly closing its doors. The statue stood to the turn of the century, her green patina deepening as the copper oxidized, a physical sign of her aging in the harsh salt air. But as the 1920s approached, the dark truth would take a geopolitical turn. It was 2:08 a.m. on July 30th, 1916. The residents of Manhattan and Jersey City were jolted from their beds by a sound that many described as the end of the world. A massive fireball, visible as far away as Maryland, tore through the darkness of the harbor. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was the Black Tom explosion. Just a few hundred yards from the Statue of Liberty sat Black Tom Island, a massive shipping terminal packed with 2 million pounds of ammunition and TNT destined for the Allied forces in World War I. While the United States was technically neutral at the time, it was secretly the arsenal of democracy. German saboteurs, knowing that these shells would soon be falling on their brothers in Europe, decided to bring the war to New York Harbor. The blast was the equivalent of a 5.5 magnitude earthquake. Windows were shattered as far north as Times Square. But the most prestigious victim of the blast was the lady in the harbor. As the shock wave hit the statue, the copper plates groaned and buckled. Shrapnel, red-hot chunks of iron, and jagged pieces of shipping crates pierced the statue's skin. But the most significant damage occurred at the very top. The arm holding the torch, already a point of structural weakness due to Bartholdi's design flaws, was nearly severed from the shoulder. This is a dark truth that most tourists today never realize. The torch you see now is not the original, and the reason you cannot go up into it is not just crowd control. It is a matter of permanent structural trauma. Before 1916, visitors could climb a cramped ladder inside the arm and stand on the balcony of the torch, looking out over the Atlantic. On the night of the Black Tom explosion, the internal bracing of the arm was warped so severely that engineers declared it a death trap. The arm was patched, the rivets were replaced, but the bone was broken. To this day, over 100 years later, the National Park Service maintains a strict no-entry policy for the arm. It remains a silent, vertical graveyard of the first great war's reach into America. Why is the Black Tom explosion a dark truth? Because at the time, the U.S. government went to extraordinary lengths to downplay it. President Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Admitting that German agents had successfully blown up the New York harbor and damaged the nation's most iconic monument would have forced his hand into a war the public wasn't ready for. The official narrative initially leaned toward an accidental fire. The devastation to the statue was minimized in the press. The government chose to prioritize political optics over the truth of a national security breach. It wasn't until years later, long after the war ended, that a commission finally proved the German government was responsible. The mother of exiles had been a casualty of war before the country even admitted it was fighting one. While the torch was closed off, another secret was being buried beneath her feet. Inside the massive granite pedestal lies a labyrinth of rooms and corridors that the public never sees. During the World War eras, these spaces weren't just for storage. They served as a military command center. Because of its strategic height and position, the Statue of Liberty was militarized. From 1886 to 1923, the island was technically a military post, Fort Wood. Soldiers lived in brick houses at the base of the statue. The lady wasn't a park ranger's ward. She was an Army asset. The irony is staggering. The symbol of peace and liberty was surrounded by cannons, artillery shells, and men trained for slaughter. Even today, there are parts of the pedestal's foundation, the original star-shaped walls of Fort Wood, that are off-limits. Rumors have persisted for decades about Level Zero, a space where early intelligence agencies monitored harbor traffic and telegraph cables. The statue wasn't just enlightening the world, she was spying on it. By the mid-1920s, a physical transformation was complete that changed the statue's identity forever. When she arrived in 1885, she was the color of a shiny new penny. She glowed a brilliant, fiery orange in the sun. But the salt air of the Atlantic is a corrosive mistress. Through a chemical process called patination, the copper reacted with the sulfuric acid in the air, a byproduct of New York's coal-burning factories. Slowly, the orange turned to a dull brown, then a muddy black, and finally, the iconic seafoam green we see today. In 1906, Congress was so horrified by her turning green that they appropriated $62,000 to paint the statue. They thought the green was a sign of decay, a rot on the face of American liberty. It was only after a massive public outcry and a letter from the copper industry, who explained that the patina actually protected the metal, that the government backed down. The dark truth of her color is that Lady Liberty is essentially wearing the pollution of New York City. Her green skin is a layer of chemical waste, a permanent record of the industrial smog that fueled America's rise to power. She didn't choose her color. The city chose it for her. The statue survived the explosion. She survived the military occupation, and she survived the attempt to paint over her history. But a new, more insidious threat was emerging. As the 1930s approached, the mother of exiles was about to face the ultimate test of her message. In the early summer of 1939, a luxury liner named the Mississippi St. Louis appeared on the horizon. On board were 937 passengers, mostly Jewish refugees fleeing the rising tide of Nazi Germany. They had seen the synagogues burn on Kristallnacht. They had felt the walls of the ghettos closing in. To them, the Statue of Liberty wasn't just a monument. She was a literal life raft. As the ship sailed past the torch, the passengers crowded the decks. Many wept. Children were held up to see the Lady of Hope. They believed that if they could just reach her shadow, the nightmare of the Third Reich would be over. But as the ship dropped anchor, a dark truth began to emerge. The statue's light didn't reach everyone. To understand why the St. Louis was in trouble, we have to look at the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. This was a piece of legislation born from the eugenics movement we discussed in Part 4. It set strict national origin quotas, specifically designed to keep out undesirables, mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians. By 1939, the American government had become paralyzed by isolationism and xenophobia. Even as the smoke rose from the chimneys of early concentration camps, the U.S. State Department remained obsessed with the letter of the law. The passengers of the St. Louis had valid visas for Cuba, but when they arrived in Havana, they were turned away due to political corruption. They then turned toward the mother of exiles, pleading for sanctuary. The ship hovered so close to the Florida coast that the passengers could see the lights of the hotels. They sent a frantic telegram to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, begging for entry. They waited for the woman with the torch to speak for them. The response? Silence. The U.S. Coast Guard was dispatched, not to rescue the refugees, but to shadow the ship and ensure that not a single person jumped overboard to swim to liberty. The dark truth is that the American government used the very water surrounding the statue as a watery prison wall. Under the shadow of the monument that said, "Give me your tired, your poor," the United States told 937 desperate human beings that they were too tired and too poor for American soil. The St. Louis was forced to turn back. As the ship sailed past the Statue of Liberty one last time, heading back toward the graveyard of Europe, the passengers looked at her with a different expression. She was no longer a mother. She was a ghost. She was a hollow copper shell that promised a freedom she was unwilling to provide. Of those 937 passengers, 254 would eventually be murdered in the Holocaust. Their blood is an invisible stain on the pedestal of the statue. This event proved that the Golden Door was a revolving door, one that could be slammed shut by a pen stroke in Washington, D.C., regardless of the copper poetry in New York Harbor. During this era, the dark truth took on a psychological layer. The U.S. government realized that while they were closing their borders, they needed the image of the statue to maintain their moral high ground on the world stage. The Statue of Liberty began to appear on war bonds and recruitment posters. She was being weaponized as a symbol of the American way, even as that way included segregated military units and the denial of Jewish refugees. The statue became a tool of state-sponsored branding. She was used to sell a version of America to the world that didn't actually exist for millions of people inside its borders. While the world was falling apart, the island itself was undergoing a strange transformation. The military presence at Fort Wood, at the base of the statue, was intensified. The lady was now surrounded by anti-aircraft guns. If you were a civilian in 1941, you couldn't just wander around the statue. The island was a high-security zone. The dark truth of this period is that Liberty was essentially under house arrest. She was a prisoner of the very defense system meant to protect her. The beautiful park-like atmosphere we know today was a war-torn landscape of bunkers, barracks, and barbed wire. Beneath the surface, the physical statue was suffering. The 1930s and 40s were decades of neglect. The galvanic corrosion we mentioned in Part 2 was accelerating. The iron skeleton was expanding as it rusted, literally popping the rivets out of the copper skin. Inside the statue, condensation was constant. It rained inside Lady Liberty every time the temperature shifted. The internal structure was becoming a skeleton of rust. It was a perfect metaphor for the era, a beautiful, shining exterior, while the internal supports were crumbling under the weight of neglect and the salt of the sea. The war would eventually end, and the mother of exiles would be hailed as a victor. But as the 1950s dawned, a new kind of darkness would settle over the harbor. The fear of the other hadn't disappeared. It had just changed colors. By the 1950s, the Statue of Liberty had a new job. She was no longer just welcoming immigrants. She was a frontline soldier in the war against communism. The U.S. government realized that if they could maintain the image of the shining city on a hill, they could win the hearts and minds of the developing world. But there was a dark truth to this branding. While the State Department was sending photos of Lady Liberty to every corner of the globe, the FBI was using the island as a literal surveillance post. The Red Scare had turned New York Harbor into a hive of paranoia. If you were an immigrant arriving in the shadow of the statue in 1952, you weren't just checked for disease. You were checked for thought crimes. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 intensified the vetting process. Under the gaze of the torch, thousands of people were interrogated about their political affiliations. If you had ever attended a labor union meeting in Europe or read the wrong pamphlet, the mother of exiles slammed the door in your face. Liberty had become conditional. As the 1960s rolled in, the tension shifted from external enemies to internal ones. The civil rights movement and the Vietnam War were tearing the American social fabric apart. To many activists, the Statue of Liberty was no longer a symbol of hope. She was a symbol of hypocrisy. In February 1965, the NYPD and the FBI uncovered a plot that sounded like a Hollywood thriller, but it was terrifyingly real. A group of 4 radicals, including a member of the Revolutionary Action Movement, planned to dynamite the Statue of Liberty. Their target wasn't the pedestal. They wanted to decapitate her. They planned to place explosives in the head and the arm, essentially killing the symbol to protest the lack of liberty for Black Americans and the victims of the statue's enlightenment abroad. The dark truth of 1965 is that the statue was nearly a pile of copper rubble in the harbor. The plot was only foiled because an undercover police officer had infiltrated the group. During this period, the physical island was a mess. While the statue looked majestic from a distance, up close, the cracks were showing, both literally and figuratively. The National Park Service had taken over, but the budget was a pittance. The dark truth of the 1960s and 70s is that the Statue of Liberty was rotting from the inside out. The salt air had turned the internal iron structure into a brittle, rusted cage. Huge chunks of iron were flaking off. The torch was leaking so badly that the flame was essentially a bucket for rainwater. Visitors would climb the spiral staircase, blissfully unaware that the very skeleton holding them up was structurally compromised. The government kept the doors open because closing the statue for repairs would be a public relations disaster during the Cold War. They chose the image of strength over the reality of safety. In 1971, the statue became a literal battleground. A group of 15 Vietnam veterans against the war, VVW, seized the island. They didn't bring bombs. They brought their bodies. They occupied the statue for 2 days, hanging an upside-down American flag from the crown, the universal signal of distress. They stayed in the crown, looking out over the harbor, refusing to leave until the government addressed the crimes being committed in the name of liberty in Southeast Asia. The dark truth is that for 48 hours, the most famous symbol of American government was held hostage by its own disillusioned soldiers. It was a visual representation of a nation at war with its own soul. There's a smaller, more subtle dark truth from this era, the name change. In 1956, Congress officially changed the name of the island from Bedloe's Island to Liberty Island. On the surface, it seemed like a simple branding move, but in reality, it was an act of historical erasure. Isaac Bedloe, the original owner, was a colonial merchant whose history was tied to the very old-world complexities the statue was meant to transcend. By renaming the island, the government tried to turn the land into a theme park of an ideal rather than a place with a real, complicated history. They wanted the statue to stand on a pedestal of liberty, not on a pile of colonial dirt. By the end of the 1970s, the statue had turned a deep, ghostly green. Scientists began to realize that the patina wasn't just copper carbonate. It was a complex cocktail of lead, arsenic, and sulfur, the residue of a century of New York City's industrial greed. The statue was literally breathing the toxic history of the city. Every time it rained, acid rain would slightly melt the copper, washing a green, toxic sludge down into the soil of the island. The mother of exiles was standing in a circle of poisoned earth. As the 1980s approached, the dark truth was no longer a secret that could be hidden with a coat of paint. The statue was dying. The arm was swaying too much in the wind. The torch was a jagged piece of rusted metal, and the internal bones were ready to snap. In the early 1980s, a team of French and American engineers conducted a physical on the statue. What they found was horrifying. The internal iron framework, the bones designed by Gustave Eiffel, had expanded so much from rust that they were literally bloating against the copper skin. This is a phenomenon known as rust jacking. The iron was pushing the copper rivets out like shrapnel. Even worse was the arm. The 1916 Black Tom explosion from Part 5 had left a permanent misalignment. The arm was not attached to the central pylon correctly. It was leaning several feet to the side, held up by little more than luck and rusted Victorian iron. If a major hurricane had hit New York in 1982, there's a very high probability the torch, and the arm holding it, would have snapped off and plunged 300 feet into the harbor. To save her, the government launched the largest restoration project in history. For 2 years, the Statue of Liberty disappeared behind a 300-ton cage of aluminum scaffolding. It was the largest freestanding scaffolding in the world. But as workers peeled back the copper skin to replace the iron ribs, they found the dark truth of Bartholdi's construction. It wasn't just age that was killing her. It was human error. The engineers discovered that the head had been installed 2 feet off-center. The shoulder was misaligned. Bartholdi, in his rush to meet the 1886 deadline, had made adjustments that created massive stress points. The statue was a masterpiece of art, but it was an engineering nightmare of make-it-work patches. The most controversial moment of the surgery was the removal of the torch. For a century, the amber glass of the torch had been the statue's eye to the world, but it was also her greatest wound. Because Bartholdi's original design was a solid copper flame, and later improvements had cut holes into it for glass panes, the torch acted as a giant funnel for rainwater. The internal structure of the arm was essentially a vertical sewer pipe. The decision was made. The original torch had to go. It was unceremoniously lowered by a crane. A severed limb of history. The dark truth. Here is a bitter irony. The original torch, the one Bartholdi touched, the one that survived the 1916 explosion, was replaced by a replica. The new torch is covered in 24-karat gold leaf. It is shinier, it is prettier, and it reflects the light better for television cameras. But it is a fake. The original torch now sits in a museum at the base, a discarded relic of an era when liberty was allowed to have flaws. How do you clean a century of dark truths off a copper goddess? The interior of the statue was coated in layers of lead paint and coal tar, toxic residues from the industrial age. To remove them without melting the thin copper, engineers use a revolutionary and dangerous technique: liquid nitrogen. Workers blasted the interior with sub-zero liquid nitrogen, which froze the tar and paint, causing them to pop off the copper like ice. It was a freezing, suffocating environment. The mother of exiles was being stripped naked in a cloud of white gas. And then there were the rivets. Over 30,000 copper rivets had to be replaced by hand. Each one was a tiny scar being healed. But as they replaced them, the workers found something bizarre. Graffiti from the 1880s etched into the inside of the copper plates. Names of French laborers' dates, and crude drawings that were never meant to be seen. The statue wasn't just a monument. It was a 150-foot bathroom wall of the 19th century working class. The restoration culminated in Liberty Weekend in 1986, the centenary. It was a massive, televised spectacle presided over by President Ronald Reagan. This is where the dark truth of the statue's identity was finalized. Reagan used the statue to symbolize the new morning in America. He leaned heavily into the immigrant narrative, officially cementing the mother of exiles persona while his administration simultaneously moved to tighten border controls and ramp up the Cold War. The statue became a corporate logo. The restoration had been funded by private donations, led by Lee Iacocca, the head of Chrysler. For the first time, a national monument was sponsored by big business. The dark truth of 1986 is that the Statue of Liberty was sold to save her. She became a Liberty product, a backdrop for a 4th of July party that felt more like a commercial than a commemoration of freedom. Even after the millions of dollars spent, one thing remained unchanged: the feeling of the crown. If you climb the 354 steps to the top, you realize how small it is. It's cramped, it's hot, and the windows are tiny slits. From the crown, you can see the world, but the world cannot see you. You are encased in a copper skull. This is the ultimate metaphor for the dark truth of the 1980s. America had saved the body of liberty, but they had turned her into a tourist attraction. She was healed, but she was also hollowed out. The 1980s gave the statue a new lease on life, a golden torch and a corporate sheen. But as the millennium approached, the world changed again. On a clear September morning in 2001, the mother of exiles would watch from across the water as the sky fell. On the morning of September 11th, the Statue of Liberty stood as she always had, torch high, eyes fixed on the horizon. But as the first plane struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center, just 1.5 miles across the water, the mother of exiles became a helpless witness to the greatest tragedy in New York's history. From the narrow windows of her crown, National Park Service rangers watched the towers fall. They saw the black smoke billow across the harbor, eventually enveloping the statue in a shroud of ash and debris. In that moment, the dark truth shifted. The statue was no longer a welcoming host. She was a high-value target. Within minutes of the second strike, the island was evacuated. The golden door didn't just close, it was bolted from the inside. For nearly 3 years after September 11th, no tourist set foot on Liberty Island. The statue stood alone in a silent harbor, guarded by armed Coast Guard patrols and shadowed by NYPD helicopters. The dark truth of this era is that the American government considered the statue too dangerous to open. There were classified intelligence reports suggesting that the statue was a primary target for a symbolic decapitation. The fear wasn't just a bomb, it was a psychological blow of seeing the torch fall. While the rest of New York began to rebuild, the Statue of Liberty remained a red zone. When she finally reopened in 2004, she wasn't a park anymore. She was a fortress. If you visit the statue today, you experience the dark truth of modern liberty before you even board the ferry. You are subjected to airport-style security, X-rays, magnetic wanding, and bomb-sniffing dogs. But there's a deeper, more invasive layer. After September 11th, the National Park Service installed a massive, high-tech security bunker underneath the pedestal. This command center monitors every square inch of the island with thermal cameras, facial recognition software, and vibration sensors that can detect a heartbeat inside the copper skin. The irony is thick enough to choke on. To visit the symbol of freedom, you must surrender your privacy, your movement, and your anonymity. The mother of exiles is now the most watched woman in the world, surrounded by a digital cage that her original creators could never have imagined. The tension between the statue's message and the government's actions reached a boiling point on July 4th, 2018. As the nation celebrated Independence Day, a woman named Therese Patricia Okuma bypassed the million-dollar security systems and climbed the base of the statue. She sat at the feet of Lady Liberty, 25 feet above the ground, in a 3-hour standoff with the NYPD's emergency service unit. Her protest was against the zero-tolerance immigration policy and the separation of families at the U.S.-Mexico border. The dark truth, revealed that day, was visual. As the police struggled to pull her down, the cameras caught the image of a woman huddled at the feet of Liberty, while the statue's copper hand seemed to reach over her, helpless to protect her. It was a 21st century echo of the 1939 Mississippi St. Louis tragedy. It proved that despite the new gold on the torch, the debate over who belonged in the shadow of the statue is as raw and unresolved as it was in 1886. Even though the island is open, the statue herself remains under a form of house arrest. The arm and the torch, as we know, are permanently closed. But after September 11th, the crown was also closed for 8 long years. When it finally reopened in 2009, it was under a lottery system so restrictive that only a tiny fraction of visitors ever make it to the top. The dark truth of the internal structure is that it is a fire marshal's nightmare. The spiral staircase is so narrow that a two-way flow is impossible. If a fire or an attack occurred while people were in the crown, there would be no escape. The lady is a beautiful monument, but as a building, she is a death trap. The government spends millions every year on mitigation, but the reality is that the 19th century design simply cannot handle the 21st century's fear. There is one more dark truth haunting the Fortress of Liberty, the sea. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy slammed into the harbor. While the statue herself stood firm, the island was devastated. 75% of the island was underwater. The sophisticated security systems were fried by salt water. The brick walkways were ripped up like paper, and the electrical grid was destroyed. Scientists now warn that by 2050, Liberty Island could face permanent flooding. The mother of exiles might soon be standing in a permanent lake of rising salt water. We are spending billions to protect her from terrorists, but we are losing the battle against the very ocean she was meant to welcome people across. To find the first shadow of liberty, we have to return to the city of her birth, Paris. Most tourists walking along the Seine River are startled to find a bronze Lady Liberty standing on the Isle aux Cygnes. It is exactly 1/4 the size of the New York original. But here's the dark truth about the Paris statue. It was given to the city by American expatriates in 1889 to celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution. However, the French government originally faced the statue toward the Eiffel Tower, turning its back on America. It wasn't until the 1937 World's Fair that the statue was finally turned around to face west, toward her big sister in New York. Even in her home country, the statue was a political pawn, a symbol of a strained relationship where neither side could quite agree on what liberty meant. The most tragic shadow appeared in 1989. In the heart of Beijing's Tiananmen Square, student protesters constructed a 33-foot tall statue made of foam and papier-mâché over a metal armor. They called her the goddess of democracy. She was a direct homage to the Statue of Liberty, but with a dark truth twist. She held the torch with both hands, a symbol of the immense effort required to keep hope alive in an autocracy. For 5 days, she stared down the portrait of Mao Zedong. But on June 4th, as the tanks rolled in, the goddess was the first to fall. She was crushed by a Type 59 tank. Her foam shattered into white dust. The American Statue of Liberty watched from across the ocean, her image used to inspire a revolution that ended in a massacre. The dark truth is that the statue's image can be a death sentence in the wrong hands. By becoming a global icon, Lady Liberty stopped being a gift and started being a provocation. Not all clones are noble. In the dark truth of commercialism, the statue has been degraded into a gimmick. From the neon-lit Lady Liberty in Las Vegas to the kitschy replicas in tax haven amusement parks, the symbol has been stripped of its abolitionist roots. But there is a darker version. In some parts of the world, anti-American regimes have built inverse liberties. In Tehran, Iran, murals and sculptures depict the Statue of Liberty as a skeleton, her torch a symbol of burning oppression rather than enlightenment. The dark truth is that half the world, the statue is not a mother of exiles, but the mistress of imperialism. Her image is a Rorschach test. What you see in her depends entirely on which side of the American drone or the American dollar you stand on. For decades, a persistent dark truth rumor has circulated through the internet that the original model for the statue was a black woman and that the real statue with African features was rejected by the U.S. government. As a narrator committed to facts, here is the nuance. While there is no evidence of a secret black statue being hidden in a warehouse, the intent was undeniably tied to black liberation. As we explored in Part 1, the broken shackles at her feet were the primary symbol. The dark truth isn't that the statue was replaced. It's that her identity was bleached. By making her features classically Roman and Greco-European, Bartholdi and Laboulaye made her safe for a white American public that was not yet ready to see a black face as the face of freedom. The black statue exists not in copper, but in the suppressed intentions of her creators. Where did the copper actually come from? For a century, the dark truth was a mystery. Some said it was French. Others said it was mined in the American West. But in the 1980s, metallurgical testing revealed a shocking origin. Most of the copper in the Statue of Liberty likely came from a mine in Viennes, Norway. This means a French gift to America was made of Viking metal. The mine was owned by a French company, and the ore was shipped across the North Sea. The Mother of Exiles is physically composed of the earth, a nation that was, at the time, seeing its own massive wave of emigration to the U.S. The statue is a literal mosaic of the world. She is French design, Norwegian copper, German-American engineering, Eiffel and Roebling, and she stands on a pedestal built by the pennies of Jewish, Irish, and Italian immigrants. The dark truth is that she is a stateless entity, a woman without a country, made of pieces of everyone, belonging to no one. In 1950, the Boy Scouts of America launched a Strengthen the Arm of Liberty campaign. They installed over 200 small copper statues in towns across the U.S. The dark truth of these miniatures is that they have become grave markers for the American dream. Many of them today are forgotten, covered in graffiti in dying Rust Belt towns, or sold at auctions when small-town budgets fail. They are the lesser lights. Standing in parks where the huddled masses are now the local homeless population. They serve as a haunting reminder that a statue cannot provide liberty. It can only represent the absence of it. The shadows of liberty cover the globe, from the riverbanks of Paris to the blood-stained squares of Beijing. But as we return our focus to the original Lady in the Harbor, we must face the most disturbing dark truth of all, the mystery of her face. To understand the dark truth of Lady Liberty's soul, you have to look at the men who built her. Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi was not just a sculptor. He was a high-ranking member of the Freemasons, specifically the Alsace-Lorraine Lodge in Paris. His mentor and the man who conceived the project, Edouard de Laboulaye, was also deeply embedded in Masonic circles. In the late 19th century, Freemasonry wasn't just a social club. It was a powerful, secretive network of intellectuals who believed in the great architect of the universe. When they looked at the United States, they didn't see a Christian nation. They saw a Masonic experiment. The Statue of Liberty was their ultimate statement, a lighthouse of reason, intended to guide the world away from traditional religion and toward a new, enlightened order. The most visible dark truth of this Masonic connection is buried in the pedestal. On August 5th, 1884, the cornerstone of the pedestal was laid in a massive, formal Masonic ceremony. The Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York presided over the event. He wore his ritual apron, carried a ceremonial trowel, and scattered corn, wine, and oil over the stone, ancient symbols of nourishment, refreshment, and joy. But to the public watching, it looked like a strange, pagan ritual. Why was the most famous symbol of American freedom being consecrated by a secret society rather than a religious or purely civic body? The dark truth is that the statue's foundation is literally built on Masonic ritual. If you look at the original invitations to the dedication, the Masonic square and compass were as prominent as the American flag. The Mother of Exiles was, first and foremost, a sister of the lodge. Who is she? We call her Liberty. But to the Masons, she represented something much older, Libertas, the Roman goddess. But some occult historians suggest a darker, dark truth. They point to the 7 spikes on her crown. While the official guidebooks say the 7 spikes represent the 7 continents and the 7 seas, esoteric scholars point to Babylonian goddess Ishtar, also known as Inanna or Columbia. Ishtar was the queen of heaven, a deity of both love and war, often depicted with a radiant crown and a torch. In the ancient world, Ishtar was a goddess of the great harlot of Babylon, a figure associated with the breaking of boundaries and the overturning of social orders. Was Bartholdi secretly carving a pagan idol in the heart of a supposedly Christian harbor? If you look at the statue's face, stern, impassive, almost masculine, it bears a striking resemblance to the ancient depictions of the sun god, Helios, or Sol Invictus. The statue isn't a mother. She is an ancient, unyielding solar deity wearing a woman's robes. The torch itself is the most powerful dark truth symbol. In Masonic and Illuminati lore, the torch represents the light of reason or the fire of Prometheus. Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, an act of rebellion that led to his eternal torture. To the occultist, the torch isn't a welcome light. It is the light of Lucifer, literally the light bringer. This doesn't mean the statue is satanic in the modern sense, but it does mean she represents a philosophy of human self-deification. She suggests that humanity does not need God. We have our own light. We have our own fire. The dark truth is that the Statue of Liberty is a 151-foot Declaration of Independence, not just from Britain, but from the heavens themselves. Look closely at the crown again. The 7 spikes form a perfect sunburst. In numerology, the number 7 is sacred, representing completion and divine order. But when combined with the 25 windows in the crown, 2 plus 5 is equal to 7. The number repeats. Masonic architecture is obsessed with sacred geometry. The placement of the statue, her height, and even the angle of her torch were all calculated to align with specific celestial markers. Some researchers claim that on the summer solstice, the sun rises in a direct line with the torch as seen from specific points in Manhattan. The Mother of Exiles is a giant sundial of the soul, a mathematical monument hidden in plain sight. In her left hand, she holds a tablet. We are told it is the Declaration of Independence. But look at the shape. It is a diptych, a format used for ancient law tablets. It is inscribed with July 4 MDCCLXXVI. The dark truth of the tablet is its placement. She holds it close to her body, while the torch is held far away. In occult symbolism, this represents a hidden knowledge versus the revealed knowledge. The light is for the masses, the tablet of law is for those who stand close to her. It is a reminder that in the Masonic Republic, there is a law for the people and a secret law for the enlightened. For over 140 years, the Masonic mask has remained intact. The National Park Service rarely mentions the Masonic ceremony in its standard tours. They prefer the Emma Lazarus version, the soft, poetic, welcoming mother. But the dark truth is that the statue is a Janus Face monument. To the immigrant on the boat, she is a mother. To the elite in the lodge, she is a symbol of the great work, the transformation of the world through human intellect and secret power. She is the ultimate hidden in plain sight mystery. In the early 2020s, a quiet project began within the National Park Service and tech giants. The goal was noble digital preservation. Using LiDAR, light detection, and ranging technology, every millimeter of the statue was scanned to create a perfect 1:1 digital twin. But the dark truth is that this digital twin is not just a backup. It has become the primary experience. In 2026, more people visit the Statue of Liberty via VR headsets and metaverse platforms than set foot on the island. In these digital worlds, the statue is always perfect. The green patina is bright, the torch never leaks, and the inconvenient parts of history, the broken chains, the industrial waste of the harbor, are digitally scrubbed. We are creating a Disney-fied version of Liberty that is more real to the public than the rusting, salt-stained woman in the harbor. As the physical statue ages, her history is being rewritten in the digital clouds. AI-generated documentaries and educational deepfakes are beginning to flood the internet. In some versions, the abolitionist origins we discussed in Part 1 are completely removed to satisfy modern political sensibilities. In others, the Mother of Exiles myth is exaggerated to the point of historical fiction. The dark truth is that we are losing the primary source. When the physical statue eventually becomes too dangerous or too expensive to maintain, a reality we are fast approaching, the digital version will be the only one left. And the digital version can be edited. The torch can be made to glow with whatever political color is in fashion. The tablet can be rewritten. We are entering an era where liberty is whatever the algorithm says it is. There is a psychological phenomenon occurring on Liberty Island today. Tourists spend more time looking at the statue through their smartphone screens than with their own eyes. They are recording a simulation of the experience. The dark truth is that the physical presence of the statue, the smell of the salt, the vibration of the wind against the copper, the sheer scale that makes a human feel insignificant, is being lost. When we experience the statue through a screen, we lose the visceral threat of what she represents. True liberty is heavy, dangerous, and requires maintenance. A digital statue is light, safe, and requires only a like. We are trading the burden of freedom for the comfort of a pixel when you download the official Statue of Liberty app to enhance your visit. You are participating in a new kind of dark truth. The app tracks your location, your dwell time, and your facial expressions as you look at the monument. The Mother of Exiles has become a data harvest point. In the name of improving the visitor experience, the government and its tech partners are building a psychological profile of what patriotism looks like in the 21st century. The statue is no longer just watching the horizon. She is watching you, counting your heartbeats, and analyzing your biometric data. The Fortress of Freedom, Part 9, has gone digital. While the digital twin is polished and perfect, the physical reality is grim. Behind the no-entry signs, the 1980s restoration is already failing. The sea level rise we mentioned is no longer a future threat. It is a daily maintenance battle. The dark truth that the National Park Service doesn't want to broadcast is the cost of reality. It costs millions of dollars more every year to fight the Atlantic than it does to host a server for a VR experience. There's a growing unspoken consensus in some bureaucratic circles. Why keep the body alive when we have the spirit saved on a hard drive? We are witnessing the beginning of the controlled abandonment of the physical island. In the ultimate act of 21st century cynicism, the image of the statue has been fractured into thousands of digital assets. Digital ownership of the statue is being sold to the highest bidder in the form of NFTs and virtual real estate. The dark truth is that the common heritage of mankind is being reprivatized. In the 1880s, the poor gave their pennies to build a pedestal, Part 2. In the 2020s, the wealthy are buying digital shares of the statue's image. The statue is being dismantled not by shrapnel or bombs, but by the blockchain. Imagine waking up and looking out your bedroom window to see the massive green folds of a copper robe blocking the sun. For the families of the National Park Service Rangers and the Coast Guardsmen, this wasn't a dream. It was Tuesday. From 1886 until the early 2000s, there was a small cluster of brick houses on the north side of Liberty Island. The dark truth that history skips is that the Mother of Exiles actually had neighbors. There was a superintendent, a maintenance chief, and their families. They had a small playground, a community garden, and a unique problem. They lived in a place where millions of people visited every year. But once the last ferry left at 5 p.m., they were the only souls on a dark rock in the middle of the Atlantic. The most surreal dark truth involves the children who grew up there. They were the princes and princesses of the harbor. They would take a private government boat to school in Manhattan or New Jersey, carrying their lunchboxes past the armed guards. When they came home, the island was their private kingdom. They played hide-and-seek in the fort's tunnels and climbed the pedestal steps after the tourists were gone. But there was a psychological cost to owning liberty. These children grew up in a high-security fishbowl. They were taught from a young age that they were living inside a symbol, not a home. They couldn't have friends over for sleepovers without intense background checks. Their backyard was a national treasure that they weren't allowed to touch or deface. They lived in the shadow of an ideal that made their own lives feel small and temporary. The community didn't end naturally. It was dismantled after 9/11 attacks, Part 9, and the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, Part 9. The National Park Service made a cold, bureaucratic decision. They decided that having civilians living on the island was a security risk and a liability. In 2014, the last resident of Liberty Island, David Lutzinger, the statue superintendent, was forced to move out. The brick houses were demolished or converted into offices. The dark truth of 2014 is that the United States government officially decided that liberty and living were no longer compatible. The island was scrubbed of its human heartbeat to make room for more cameras and more gift shops. With the residents gone, the island at night became a tomb. But the dark truth whispered by the night shift security guards is that the island is never truly empty. Before the statue arrived, Bedloe's Island was a place of suffering. It was a pest house for the dying, a site of public hangings for pirates, and a military prison. When the families lived there, they reported strange sounds in the corridors of the pedestal, the clinking of chains that weren't copper, and voices in the wind that didn't sound like tourists. The most persistent ghost story is that of a young boy who died on the island in the early 1900s. Guards today still report seeing a small figure running near the broken chains at the statue's feet. Is it a trick of the moonlight on the patina, or is it a reminder that the ground beneath the mother of exiles is soaked in the grief of those who were never freed? The removal of the residence coincided with the final dark truth of the island's evolution, its total commercialization. Once the houses were gone, the space was used to expand the retail footprint. Today, the experience of Liberty is carefully curated to lead you toward a cash register. You can buy Liberty foam crowns made in factories where workers have no liberty. You can buy Liberty water bottles for $6 in a harbor that was once a public commons. By removing the people who actually loved and lived on the island, the government turned a sacred space into a transactional space. The mother of exiles has been turned into a saleswoman of souvenirs. There is a profound dark truth in the statue's current state. She is more famous than ever, more scanned than ever, and more guarded than ever. But for the first time in 140 years, she is alone. There is no one there to hear the copper groan in the night. There is no one there to see the sunrise from her torch without a tactical vest and a radio. The Statue of Liberty has become a museum of a dead idea. We protect the copper shell, but we have evicted the human spirit that once made the island a living part of New York. In the late 19th century, as the Statue of Liberty was being hammered into shape in Paris, a group of visionary thinkers in San Francisco proposed a mirror image. They argued that if the Atlantic had a mother of exiles to welcome those from Europe, the Pacific needed a goddess of peace to welcome those from Asia. They envisioned a colossal bronze figure standing on Alcatraz Island or the Marin Headlands, her torch facing the setting sun. It was meant to be the final bookend of the American experiment, a literal bridge of light spanning the continent. But the dark truth of 1890 is that San Francisco was not New York, and the huddled masses coming across the Pacific were not viewed with the same romanticism as those from across the Atlantic. While New York was struggling to build a pedestal for liberty, California was passing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States, and it was aimed specifically at one ethnic group. The dark truth of the lost sister statue is that she was killed by state-sponsored racism. The politicians in Washington and the power brokers in San Francisco realized that building a symbol of liberty in the West would be a massive public relations disaster. How could you have a 300-foot goddess of welcome standing at the gate while you were systematically hunting down and deporting the very people she was meant to greet? The plans for the Pacific statue were quietly buried in the National Archives. They didn't want a mother of exiles in the West. They wanted a wall. They turned Alcatraz not into a pedestal for a goddess, but into the world's most feared prison. The light of the West was replaced by the silence of the rock. Bartholdi himself was intrigued by the idea of a second Colossus. He saw it as a way to truly enlighten the world by surrounding the globe with his creations. But the dark truth, revealed in his private letters, is that he was warned to stay away from the West Coast. The American government, still reeling from the financial embarrassment of the New York pedestal Part 2, made it clear that there would be no federal funding for a sister statue. They didn't want a message of liberty to be universal. They wanted it to be directional. Liberty was for the Atlantic. The Pacific was for commerce and control. Bartholdi was told that one statue was a gift, but two statues would be an infestation. If the Statue of Liberty had a shadow, it would be Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, while Ellis Island, in the shadow of the New York statue, had a 98% acceptance rate. Angel Island was a detention center designed to keep people out. The dark truth of the Pacific is that the Golden Door was a cage. Immigrants from China, Japan, and India were held for months, sometimes years, in wooden barracks, subjected to humiliating interrogations and physical exams. They carved poems of despair into the walls, poems that asked where the liberty of America was hiding. If the Pacific statue had been built, she would have stood directly across from these barracks. She would have been a witness to the torture of the very people she was supposed to represent. By not building the statue, the American government avoided the ultimate hypocrisy. They chose a Pacific silence rather than a Pacific lie. In the 1920s, a legend began to circulate among sailors that a smaller version of the goddess of peace had actually been cast in bronze and shipped towards San Francisco, only to be lost at sea during a storm near the Farallon Islands. While there is no manifest to prove this, the dark truth of the myth is what it represents. The belief that American liberty is something that sank before it could reach the West. The idea that there is a deep-sea liberty resting in the dark, cold waters of the Pacific is a haunting metaphor for the millions of Asian immigrants whose dreams were drowned by the exclusion acts and the internment camps of World War II. In 2026, the Lost Sister has returned in a digital form. Tech billionaires in Silicon Valley have proposed building a digital liberty, a massive holographic projection at the Golden Gate. But the dark truth is the same as it was in 1890. This new liberty is not about welcoming the poor. It is about celebrating the elite. It is a subscription-based liberty, a projection that can only be seen through specialized AR glasses owned by those who can afford them. The Pacific silence has evolved into a Pacific filter. We are still unwilling to build a physical symbol of welcome in the West because we are still unwilling to face the dark truth of our borders. In the high-security archives of the National Park Service, there is a document that no politician wants to read aloud. It is a structural end-of-life projection. Every engineer knows that the Statue of Liberty is a living chemical reaction. The salt of the Atlantic is slowly but surely winning the war against the copper. The dark truth of 2026 is that we are reaching the limit of what patchwork can do. The 1980s restoration, Part 8, was supposed to last a century, but the accelerating acidity of the rain and the rising heat of the harbor have cut that timeline in half. Inside the statue, the galvanic rot is returning. The Mother of Exiles is physically tired. There will come a day, estimated by some experts to be within the next 40 to 60 years, when an internal pylon will no longer be able to support the 450,000 pounds of copper and steel. On that day, the lady will have to be dismantled, or she will collapse into her own pedestal. What happens when a symbol dies? The dark truth of the government's contingency plan is a chilling exercise in logistics. If the statue becomes structurally terminal, the plan is not to rebuild her on the island. The cost of a 21st century reconstruction, adjusted for modern safety codes and environmental regulations, is estimated at over $2 billion. The whispers in Washington suggest a phased retreat. First, the crown will be permanently welded shut. Then, the pedestal will be closed to the public. Finally, the copper skin will be removed, plate by plate, and moved to a climate-control museum on the mainland. The Mother of Exiles will become a skeleton in a closet. The island will be left as a memorial park, a star-shaped fortress Part 5, holding nothing but a memory. We are preparing for a future where liberty is a museum piece, too fragile to stand in the wind. While the engineers watch the metal, the climatologists watch the water. As we discussed in Part 9, Liberty Island is a ground zero for sea level rise. By the end of this century, the pedestal, the very foundation built by the pennies of the poor, Part 2, will likely be a permanent reef. The dark truth is a poetic tragedy. The very immigrants the statue was meant to welcome were often fleeing disasters or seeking better lives, and now, the statue herself is becoming a climate refugee. She is standing in a rising tide of the very industrial civilization she helped inspire. There is a haunting symmetry to the idea of the torch of enlightenment finally being extinguished by the rising waters of a warming planet. As the physical statue fades, the digital erasure we explored in Part 12 will be complete. To the children of 2075, the Statue of Liberty will be a high-definition hologram or VR simulation. They will never know the smell of the oxidizing copper or the dizzying sway of the crown in a gale. The dark truth is that the virtual statue will be perfect. It will never rust. It will never be protested. It will never be bombed. But it will also never be real. By trading the copper for the pixel, we are trading a difficult, heavy truth for a comfortable, light-speed lie. We are choosing a liberty that requires no maintenance, no sacrifice, and no physical presence. Before we leave the island for the last time, we must look down one more time at the feet of the statue. Those broken chains, Part 1. They were the original point of the monument, the end of slavery, the birth of true human equality. The dark truth of our 15-part journey is that those chains are still there, half hidden by the robes, overlooked by the tourists, and ignored by the history books. They remind us that liberty is not a gift given by a goddess. It is a status won by breaking something. It is a messy, violent, and ongoing process. The tragedy of the Statue of Liberty is not that she is rusting. It's that we have spent 140 years looking at the torch and forgetting the chains. As the sun sets over New Jersey marshes, casting a long, green shadow across the water, the Mother of Exiles stands in her fortress of freedom. She has seen the ships of the damned, Part 6, the shrapnel of saboteurs, Part 5, the rituals of the Masons, Part 11, and the eviction of her own children, Part 13. She is a dark truth wrapped in a golden lie. She is a monument to what we hope to be, and a mirror of what we have failed to become. The lady doesn't speak. She doesn't have to. Her silence is the most powerful part of the script. She stands there, waiting for us to decide if the liberty she represents is worth the cost of the copper, or if we are content to let her fade into the digital mist. You have heard the facts. You have seen the hidden layers. The dark truth of the Statue of Liberty is that she was never meant to be a finished story. She is an unfinished experiment. Whether she remains a beacon or becomes a shipwreck is not up to the engineers, the politicians, or the ghosts. It is up to those who still believe that the golden door should never have a lock. The torch is still held high. For now,